Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my public accountability meeting. I'm Commissioner Zoe Metcalf, and I'll be chairing the meeting today. So turning to the agenda item number 1, we have no apologies today. The minutes from the previous meeting are recorded and published on the OPFCC website and can be accessed there. And there are also, to my knowledge, no actions from the previous meeting. So we'll go on to agenda item number 2, and that's questions from the public. Thank you. Right, so the first question is from Miss Hobson, and it's about seized mobile phones and laptops. How long does North Yorkshire Police take to process a mobile phone or laptop? The receipt for the device says it may be held up to 6 months. However, I have now been told this may be up to 10 months. The delay is causing stress. I understand that West Yorkshire Police have got their return time down to about a month. What are North Yorkshire Police doing to improve the return time of devices, especially in cases when no further action is taken? So I will turn to Chief Constable Lisa. Are you taking this one?
Thank you, Zoe. I understand that ACC Butterfield's going to answer these questions for us this morning, or this afternoon, should I say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Chief. Commissioner, in response to Ms Hobson's question, it depends an awful lot on the type of the device, so and what we require from it and why. So we can, in the most serious of cases, process devices in a matter of hours. So that could be, for example, where there's an immediate threat to life or where we have an individual in custody and we need that evidence to support a charging decision and a remand in custody. Incidents that are perhaps less time critical can take longer, and they are triaged, so we would always investigate the most serious offences first. So we completely accept that means that there is some delays for other devices that are waiting in the queue. We are prioritising, as I've said, based on the highest level of risk. And we do accept that seizure or surrender of a mobile phone does cause stress, anxiety and worry. So more than happy to pick this particular case up after the call and obviously link in with Ms Hobson to give it an update. But just by way of reassurance, we have also recently invested significantly in our digital forensics capability. We've seen a 40% increase in our resourcing into that team, which is a brilliant position for us to be in. And as we start to recruit those individuals, we will be reviewing our service level agreements and making sure that we are absolutely delivering the best level of service, acknowledging the impact that taking such a device can have from people.
Thank you very much. On to question 2 from Ms Prothero about custody booking in process. Please could you clarify if a person who has been detained at custody is allowed to inform someone of their whereabouts? If so, are they allowed to access their mobile phone to do so? Not many people know numbers off by heart now that we live in a technological world. So over to you, Lindsay, for the answer, please.
Thank you. So the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. Anybody coming into custody has an entitlement to have somebody informed that they've been arrested. And if we need to facilitate the retrieval of a telephone number from a mobile device, then we can support that in custody as well. So yes, absolutely is the answer to that question.
That's great. Thank you very much. And those 2 questions were really good. So thank you for those. So on to agenda item 3. And that's North Yorkshire Fire Rescue Service risk profile presentation by Dave Winspear. So Dave, over to you, please.
Can someone just tell me if it's shown, please? Yes?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Marvellous, thank you. Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon about our community risk profile. We've been asked a series of questions today, which hopefully I'm going to answer in full. But in effect, we've been asked to explain what the purpose of a community risk profile is and to take you through the process that we've used to actually build our current risk profile and how we intend to use it. We've been asked to provide assurance on how the profiling exercise is aligned to good practice and national guidance, so I shall explain that. I'll provide an explanation of how we define risk and what risk is and how we're using that in the risk profiling exercise as a service for our decision making, and how we use that to inform those decisions about how best to align our resources to that risk. And I'll also explain a bit further about how we intend to use that information that's now available to us currently and in the future to better target our resources. And by resources, what I mean there is how we deliver our 4 strands to our service, which is prevention, protection, supporting community resilience and response. And I'll touch a bit more on that as we go through this presentation. Fire and rescue services nationally work to something called a national framework. The current national framework was produced in 2018, and that requires all fire and rescue authorities, and therefore vicariously the fire and rescue services, to do the following things. We're expected to make appropriate provision for fire prevention and fire protection activities and the response to fire and rescue related activities or incidents. And I stress the word there, rescue, because traditionally a lot of people associate the fire service with fire naturally, but our role over the last several decades has really broadened out, and rescue and technical rescue is something that is actually a very significant area of our business. We're also expected to identify and assess the full range of foreseeable fire and rescue related risks in our service area. And we're also expected to collaborate with other emergency services and local and national partners to increase our efficiency and effectiveness in the services that we provide. So in order for us to achieve this, it's essential that we understand what we mean by current and future risks, and to understand what those potential impacts will be on the population that reside in North Yorkshire and the City of York, and also those that visit and work in that service area. We really need to fully understand our communities, and we need to be able to know what is required of us in how we serve them in the places that they live and work. Like most public safety sector organisations, our resources are quite limited and often quite stretched. So it's important that whilst we're building up a community risk profile and how that leads to our resourcing of our service, that we do so in the most effective and efficient way possible to us. And this community risk profile paves the way for decision makers to have the best insight into what that looks like and means for our community. But we recognise that our community and the society is constantly changing and evolving, and so we need to be aware of how we continue to remodel, rework our community risk profile to be really up to date on what it is that we are there to do in terms of our 4 service mechanisms that I just talked about there. So with regards to the question about how we've followed good practice and national frameworks, well, the simple answer is yes, we have. There is something called the National Fire Chiefs Council. The National Fire Chiefs Council has a number of project groups that are in place to support the fire sector in better understanding of what is good practice and the ways to actually go about doing things. And one of those project groups is around community risk management. Now, when we started our community risk plan profiling exercise over 2 years ago, that particular project group was in its infancy, and so the amount of information available was not as full as it is now. So we had the opportunity to design and develop our own approach to how we built our community risk profile. But what was really interesting and very pleasing for us is as and when that project team started to release information, and this slide shows you what the planning framework is and looks like from the NFCC, we were very, very much in line with what's there. We did it, but it is there now, really, really well aligned to what this shows. But basically, in essence, we look at defining the scope. So what do we want from a community profile? What do we understand by hazards? And I will explain a bit more of those in a moment. How do we undertake some form of analysis around that? So again, what is the data that we use? What's the information that we had available to us to identify and calculate a level of risk, and how do we show that? And then how do we use that going forward to make decisions in the short term, but perhaps more importantly in the strategic and long-term area, whereby we're making decisions on how we shape and resource our service to really best deliver to the needs of the community. And then finally, as always, it's about how do we evaluate what we've done to make sure that what we're doing is right and proper, really making a difference, having high impact, and is value for money. So when we talk about hazards and we talk about risk, we know because this is what we're involved with, managing risk, that there are many different things that we attend and deal with. But we've focused very much in this community risk profile exercise on 3 significant areas, and tracking back to what I've just talked about from the National Framework document. So whilst we know that we have fires in all sorts of places, commercial buildings, agricultural buildings, vehicles, open spaces, the actual area where we know that we're most likely to see a significant consequence from a fire is actually accidental dwelling fires, so fires in the home. And our experience, unfortunately, but also, we're aware, tells us that this is often the place where people unfortunately die or have serious injuries from fire. So we've very much focused on accidental dwelling fire risk, and I shall explain a little bit more in a moment what that looks like and what we've used to define and understand that better. Road risk, again, is something that in North Yorkshire is of significance to us, not just the fire service, but equally today we're talking with colleagues and partners from North Yorkshire Police. But road risk in particular, that leads to fatalities and serious injuries, is a really significant area of focus for us. So we've used that as a priority area of focus for understanding risk in our county and service area. And the third area is around water risk. Now we can break this down into 2 parts. The first being flooding, which we can actually, and again I'll explain later, but we know that we can have some predictability about where floods and when floods will happen. But there are also other water-related events that happen, which as part of our technical response to this, we've developed over a number of years. So where we have what we call swift water rescues, people getting stuck in moving water that need a very technical intervention from the fire service, we've also looked at that as well. So when we talk about risk, just to help everybody understand what we mean, we're looking really at where and when can or does a hazardous event take place. And by definition, a hazardous event is anything that has a potential to cause harm, and this might be referred to as threat or risk. So in the calculation of this, we want to know, well, what's the likelihood or the chance of something happening that puts people into that place where they could be exposed to a hazardous event? And we also want to understand what are the consequences or the outcome of that event. Now, unfortunately, in our line of work, we do have to deal with the most tragic of circumstances where people lose life. I've mentioned that in all 3 parts of the previous slide around fire, water and road. So we are very much looking at the extreme end of consequence here, but we're also looking at it in a more iterative way, and our job is to focus on getting in there early and understanding all about risk to stop these things happening. So I'll put that marker down very at the outset, is that understanding risks really help us to understand what are the factors that put people at risk, and then that shapes and help inform our intervention services like the prevention, protection and community response, and where required, our acute emergency response. In this community risk profiling, we've looked at what is predictable risk, predictive risk, and we've also used an option to show risk as relative within the North Yorkshire area. And that's been really important for us to understand, perhaps more importantly, where risk is across our service area. So I'm going to move on here into a slide that shows our combined fire risk for fire. There'll be two further slides to come which focus on water and road in a moment. So the way that we've addressed this is the county can be broken down into what are called lower super output areas, or LSOAs. And these are a very recognised way of looking at geographical areas that bound a number of residents, around about 1,500 residents in a lower super output area, or it could be bracketed around about 650 households. Across the country, there are just under 33,000 LSOAs. In North Yorkshire, we've got just over 370. And all of those LSOAs are in effect the same thing in terms of what they have within them. But you'll see on this slide that some of ours are quite large in terms of the geographical size, and some are very small, which is why we've got these blowouts we can see in the three circles showing York, Harrogate and Scarborough. So obviously in our more densely and urbanised areas where people live closely together, they are geographically much smaller, but they still have in effect the same number of residents within them. So we've used this model, or this approach, to calculate a combined fire risk for accidental dwelling fires that lead to death and serious injury. So through research and our knowledge and understanding of the problem around fire, we were able to identify some of the principal factors that we wanted to draw together and put in some sort of formula that we could then model combined risk. And those factors that we've chosen for this were age. So we know from research that over 65s living alone puts people in a higher bracket of likelihood of having a serious event in an accidental dwelling fire than people who live with others and are under 65. Frailty was something that we also recognised. In the absence of current data sets that can be released to us from other organisations like the NHS for strategic planning, we've actually used a proxy indicator for this for frailty, which has been given to us by the two upper tier authorities, so the City of York Council and North Yorkshire County Council, which was blue badge data, but done in a way which is completely anonymised. And then the other two was a social renter data set, and then finally what's called the indices of multiple deprivation, which is something that's provided from the government through the Office of National Statistics, and it basically uses a number of pieces of data and information that come together in their own right to form a score, and that score was inserted into our formula on an LSOA level. What we ended up with was a hierarchy, a list of scores against all the LSOAs, which we're then able to put into bands. And you can see in the legend on the right hand side going from very low to very high, and they were color coded. And then they were shown graphically on the map to show you where we have the risk, and it's all just relative and being compared. So as you can see, you might have some of the lighter areas in the North Yorkshire moors and dales, but if we move into some of our more urban areas, like for example parts of Scarborough or parts of Harrogate, you will see that we're moving to some of the very high areas. But I would like to really stress at this point that those areas by number are very low, and the overall picture for North Yorkshire paints one of there being very low and low risk. So what does this actually tell us as a fire and rescue service? Well,
Dave, sorry, could I just come in there quickly?
Yeah.
Just on the previous slide, so you talked earlier about the best practice that is around through the NFCC and the like, and I just wanted to ask quickly, how well does the mapping that you've got here compare to what the NFCC kind of best practice would dictate. Have we been able to use all the kind of data sets that they recommend us using? Are there any that we're missing that we'd really like to have? What kind of how well do we match up to the best practice, given what you were saying about the fact that that has come a bit after the fact?
Yeah. So some of the information that's now started to come from that project team does broaden out the data sets that you might want to consider using. When we did ours, we did consider them, and I'll give you an example, would be around smoking or alcohol. But when we explored that with the organisations that could release it, it either wasn't available or they couldn't share it at that time. Now, we are, and I'm going to come into that, I'll answer it now, Tom, if I may. This was a community risk profiling exercise done, basically it was completed a year last Christmas. But the intention is that on an annual basis, the community risk profile will be reviewed. But equally, as part of that review, we are looking to further develop the risk profiling. So we are cognizant of new information and guidance, and we will look to bring in new data sets as and when they're available. And we are currently looking to work more closely with upper tier authorities, Public Health England, NHS, etc., to look at how we can refine and develop what's available. There are, in effect, like two models that the NFCC recommend. One is what we've done, the LSOA model, which I think gives you a very good understanding of what's in the whole service area. The second is to go to a much finer level, basically to household, and that relies on the use of something called a UPRN, which stands for Unique Premises Reference Number. That is where we'd like to get to for more operational and tactical decision making. But for strategic planning, it's maybe too low. We'd have to aggregate it back up again to make decisions on a strategic level. So we're working in the background on our risk management information systems that can actually hold very up-to-date UPRN data drawn down from the National Gazetteer. And as we bring in new data sets that use that UPRN information, we'll be able to align that to, like I said, the more operational and tactical decision making. In other words, where within those LSOAs are the actual people or households that we actually want to go and engage with. So I think it's fair to say we are very, very much on the right lines with what we've achieved so far. Obviously, there is a lot of work being done in the background nationally through lots of research, including academic level studies, which are informing this. But equally, I would say we have to be very sort of realistic about what we can do. So receiving lots and lots of data requires then a lot of analysis of that data. So we're trying to have a very balanced approach about clearly understanding what risk is, where it is, but then also developing what you might describe as referral pathways and working with other organisations, going back to that first slide about collaboration, to make sure that we are working hand in hand with people who can actually signpost those individuals to us, and then we know we're targeting our resources really effectively and efficiently.
Thanks, Dave. Just one quick follow-up. I think members of the public might expect some information about building stock to be factored into this, given we've been talking about accidental dwelling fires in particular. Could you just say something about why that isn't in there for now and your intentions in the future on that front, just for the benefit?
So what I'm sharing with you and showing you here, Tom, is some slides that are taken from a very large and detailed risk profiling exercise, and it does take account of the housing stock or the building stock, and we are aligned to and aware of things like the local authority development plan. So where you see housing estates or new growth or changes to the housing stock within the North Yorkshire and New York areas, we are aware of that. But more fundamentally, the risk is not down to the actual building that you live in. It's down to the occupants and the behaviours of people within inside that household. Going forward, as I've just said, we're looking to develop our risk management information system, and that will dynamically link to the National Gazetteer, and that should give us and will give us a very, very complete picture of where the buildings are, what they're used for, and also other attributes like their age, their height, etc., etc. You know, so we'll understand, is it a terrace house, semi-detached house? Is it on 2 floors, 3 floors? We'll know if it's flats. We'll know if it's, you know, over 7 meters, over 15, 18 meters, etc. So, as I said, this is the first iteration of the community risk profile, but we are working hard to continue to develop and build it. So we will, going forward, have a much richer, more detailed insight into risk and all the contributory factors that are there for us to understand. So I hope that answers your second question.
It does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I will just move on quite quick, so I'm just conscious of the time. So what does this tell us? Well, I'd like to provide some reassurance that the risk of death and injury in residential fires is low. We recognise they still do occur, but this does show that the actual risk level is low across the service area. And also it's now shaping our understanding to actually put those prevention measures in place to actually reduce and mitigate it even further. We have a fairly consistent spread of risk across the county, but you will have noticed that there are areas where we see a growing trend. So as we move out towards the eastern seaboard of the county, and certainly on some of our border areas with other counties in the north, in the south with Humberside, we are seeing some areas where we've got slightly increased risk. As I mentioned before, in our more urbanised areas, we've got perhaps the biggest spread of risk from the very low to the very high. Okay. I'm going to move on, if I may, to just talk about road risk. I explained earlier on why that was really important. This slide...
Sorry, Dave, can I just come in? One quick question on that last slide. From the risk profile, when incidents happen during the day or evening, how does this compare to when our fire engines are available?
So once we went beyond this particular approach, we then took our incident data. So over 5 years, we've taken what we've actually been to and used that to sort of model against it. So we've now seen that the majority of our incidents take place through the sort of daytime hours, with a sort of bulge, if you like, towards the late afternoon. Mm-hmm. In terms of our availability, and I'll explain a bit more about availability when we go on to another presentation this afternoon, but we do have currently a dip within the daytime period, and then it recovers again. So they are out of step with each other. So that's why this is really useful for us, because it informs that understanding, and therefore what I said previously about how we then use this tool to make decisions about how we use our resources, so our estate, our people, our assets, our fire engines, to meet that risk. So this is part of a bigger piece of work called a risk resource model, and the two things go absolutely hand in hand. This is the risk, this is the resource. How do we align the two to best meet the needs of the community?
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that, because I think it's a really important point, Zoe, because the last point on this slide here is around those areas of our county, especially those border areas, and the third bullet is talking about a number of our areas across the east, and we could see that on the map. And obviously a lot of those areas are covered by on-call stations, aren't they? And we know that that availability can be low. So when we did the consultation around the fire and rescue plan, and the fire and rescue plan, which Zoe is just about to issue, there was really strong feedback around concern amongst the public for responding to that risk. So that's really good to hear, Dave, because I think it is important to recognise that does create a degree of risk, and that really does need fixing, doesn't it? Whether that's around prevention resources that are being put in as your last bullet on this suggests, or whether it's looking at how we can improve that on-call availability substantially.
I think there's just one final point I'd like to offer on that point, Tom, and that is that we recognise as a service and nationally that the emphasis is around prevention. What I'm talking about here is the very acute end of a problem, And yes, response is inevitably hugely important, but there are lots of other things that need to be factored in to make sure that we protect and prevent these things happening in the first place. So yeah, absolutely right in what you both asked in terms of the resourcing around response, and that is very much like a focus for us to align that response resourcing into this. But it's a much more holistic look at how we manage risk in the service area. I will just jump onto road risk. So slightly, well, a different approach here actually. We haven't used the LSOA model to look at road risk. We have used information that's drawn down from, in effect, the Department of Transport. So there are annual returns that go back into the Department of Transport around what are called killed and serious injuries. This map, which is shown as basically a heat map, shows the locations of where things actually take place. And this map is based over a 5-year period. So you can, in effect, see that we have significant activity and events that take place across the whole of the county area. If you were to lay this over the main arterial routes, you probably can sort of see the relationship between some of the main trunk roads and the motorways within the county. But also we've got a significant number of what we class as rural roads, and we do experience a lot of these type of incidents that take place on those, and also within the urban centres as well. Now, from a fire rescue perspective, we don't attend by far any at all of the incidents I'm talking about there. Our colleagues in the room from the police do, because they attend and do a lot more of the investigative work and things. But we've modelled this in its entirety about all road incidents, including pedestrians, cyclists, equine, agricultural, etc., to really understand the scale of the problem of road risk in the service area. And this helps us to understand that. We can understand now where it is. Behind this map, there is a lot more information and analysis available to us. So in effect, road risk is broken down around vehicles, roads and people. And the learning that we get from, as I just said, the collision investigations that North Yorkshire Police undertake. And that all feeds into not just our service, but a partnership, the York and North Yorkshire Road Safety Partnership, of which we and the police are very significant members of, to actually tailor our interventions to really try and support and reduce this. And you know, we're really quite excited about. We've got some very new, quite ambitious projects that we're launching through the course of the Easter about how we're working with partners to really tackle some of the key issues that we face in our service area. What did we learn from the risk profiling around road risk? It's a significant problem in North Yorkshire. By far more people die on the roads than do in fire or in water-related incidents. We have basically used this to, we now know that by taking that sort of evidence-based approach towards how we provide our services is the right way to go. I've mentioned about working in partnership, but equally, we now know from this, for example, that powered two-wheelers, so motorbikes, is a disproportionately high number of people in that county that succumb to very serious road accidents and the consequences of that. So again, we're tailoring our responses to that by using that approach, that evidence-led approach, to drive forward our prevention work.
Can I ask a question about, could you give a couple of examples for the public, please, about how you work in partnership with other outside agencies to reduce road risk? Yeah.
So I just basically mentioned there that we have the county-wide York and North Yorkshire Road Safety Partnership. We've been a very active member, along with North Yorkshire Police, the ambulance service, local authorities, your office, highways, for many years. Quite recently, there's been a new strategy launched about how we're going to approach that, and I've just touched very briefly on the kind of main 4 areas that we'd use that. But we do it through 4 delivery angles. So we do it through education, do it through engagement, we do it through engineering, and we do it through enforcement. And it's a blended approach. And the partnership operates in a way where we've got a strategic board, we've got what's called an officer working group where we make sort of tactical decisions, and then we have people who work from our respective services and forces and organisations who deliver the road safety, Quite often it is done jointly. Okay, so we work alongside colleagues. An example to give you, we're just about to launch something called a fire bike scheme. So fire bike is basically it's a motorbike which we've been lent by the police. It's branded up in a different way to theirs. It's a promotional vehicle that gets us noticed, and therefore we can engage with people from the motorcycle community. And once we start to talk to them, we're going to focus on something called Biker Down, which is basically at what to do in the event of an accident. But it also promotes wider bike safety. And we're going to do that alongside the existing scheme that the North Yorkshire Police have, which is called Bike Safe, and work very much together. So we're going to really try and address a significant problem, working collaboratively with partner organisations jointly to make sure we're tackling what we know is a very significant group of people that present a significant risk or are a very identifiable group, and hopefully we can make that their time in North Yorkshire much safer. That's just one example. But
could I ask a quick question on this as well, Dave? That map obviously shows collision density. Could you say something quickly about severity of incidents and where our most severe incidents happen in the county area? Those that involve a fatality or a serious injury, please.
Well, it doesn't show it on this map, Tom, but going back to the sources of where we can get the information and data from. So on the North Yorkshire County Council site, there is an access for yourself, for the public as well, to go onto and sort of see where KSIs, killed and serious injuries. There is no specific location. The approach we've taken in the Road Safety Partnership, I think, is really good because it helps us understand, is it around vehicle type? Is it around demographics? So, that looks at age or issues around, who's driving. So we know we see more males are killed in road traffic collisions than females are. And more males of a certain age are killed than other ages in that group as well. It is very fair to say that we see an awful lot of the high impact crashes that take place on our arterial routes. So things like the A65, the A59, the A64, these are roads that we would actually class as rural roads, albeit they are 60 mile an hour, roads and routes. Obviously, we've got the A1M, so we've got, all the way through the county now, in effect, a motorway. But when it comes to things like pedestrian, cyclists, we tend to sort of see some of that activity happening in maybe more of our urbanised areas. So again, where you've got a lot of people walking around in town centres, and actually, not all of those lead to death or serious injury, but you might see that there's an emerging problem. And we've seen that around things like when we looked at the analysis around, minor accidents around going to school and young people, coming out of school or going into school, for example. So very sort of detailed analysis of the problem informs that partnership to make good quality decisions about the choice of interventions to try and make the road safe or the road problem significantly safer.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. It was obviously there is all the prevention work and that is a really important focus. I was thinking about when the fire service is able to make those life-saving interventions through the response kind of. I remember vaguely. I wanted to check this. There was something I remember seeing around, and as you say, more of them happening on a kind of those arterial routes which aren't necessarily in our more urban spaces. And again, I just wanted to reflect on what we've already said about the need, therefore, and I don't know whether you would agree with this, the need to really make sure that our on-call stations who are, protecting those rural areas and able to respond in those rural areas, their ability to respond to those really serious incidents is going to be really important then, again.
Absolutely, yeah. And, just to pick up on that point, when I talk about resources, all of our fire engines and all of our firefighters are equipped with all the most up-to-date equipment that we can provide and the training to undertake those rescues. Fire service attend generally high impact incidents whereby people need our assistance to be extricated, cut out of a vehicle. Sometimes we're not required. A person can be released from the vehicle. The police can often do that. The ambulance service do that. So it's only quite often we get brought in as part of that acute emergency intervention to do the sorts of work that we are resourced and trained to do. But you're absolutely right in terms of making sure we have that availability, which is a very key area of our focus, just in terms of managing our availability and resources to do that.
Great, thank you.
Just to move on very quickly towards water risk, this map in effect shows in the sort of blue areas, the more densely blue areas, the floodplains. It's information that's come from the Environment Agency. So we, generally speaking, know where the likelihood of a flood event is going to take place based on that model data that they provide. And you can sort of see there, inevitably, we've got very dense areas in the sort of Selby area around York, around the Malton area and out towards Craven. The dots basically show where we've had incidents to do with either flooding or water rescue. So we know we can sort of plan and prepare for where we expect to see the flooding events. Less easy or more difficult, should I say, to actually understand where we're going to get a water-related rescue in terms of we need to go and do the technical swift water exercises. However, we do know, because of our historical demand, where we get perhaps more, and that's often around our sort of beauty spots where people tend to gather and congregate. Often the water incidents that we go to are down to some form of human behaviour or decision. And quite often we get involved now where people try and drive through flood water and get stuck. But because of the nature of what's happening, is the water is like it's moving. It's not a static. It's not a lake or a pond. It is moving water. So again, understanding that, and that's really more about changing behaviours and having the ability to respond to that sort of incident. But it is, from this modelling, what I can share with you is that we do attend more flooding incidents. It's been something that we've attended on an increasing scale over many years. And that demand for the swift water and technical rescue is also increasing. They can be complex and they can be very taxing and testing for us to do. And they do put our staff and other rescuers at considerable risk. So we train for that and we make sure they're fully equipped with all the right equipment. But it's something that we're very much aware that it's a very technical area of work for us to deal with. So with that in mind, we also know that we can have a very key role to play in supporting communities build up their own resilience around this and the pre-planning preparedness for flood events should they take place.
Dave, could I ask a question on that last point, please? How can the service support communities to build up that resilience? How can you support them to do this?
So, like I said, we've got a map and we know where people may be exposed to flooding events. As part of that preparedness, parish councils need to put some form of flood plan together, and that should understand at what point would you expect to see a flood. Who would be affected, maybe down to a household level. If a flood takes place, what will you do with those residents in terms of moving them either within inside their own home or to a safe refuge and safe place? When will you do that? How will you do that? How can you perhaps reduce or give more time? So things like putting in temporary measures like sandbagging, or if you've got some temporary fixes like the shutters that go in front of doors or walls. And I think what we can offer is a lot of advice, guidance and support in that planning based on our experience and our connection with other partners. So local resilience forums and local authority emergency planning teams. So again, I think bringing that sort of technical understanding, that expertise, that knowledge, that wherewithal to sort of help build those plans. And actually, if we know that we're going to get an event, like, for example, a flood in an area where we have more limited resources, we can move our specialist teams around to have them there in place, or go and work in those areas before we get the emergency call, say we've now got a flood. So we can do some, pardon the pun here, but the upstream activity to get in there early to actually support the communities before the event inevitably happens. But the impact of that event is reduced.
Thank you.
So how have we used this? Well, we've used this to basically frame a strategic intent statement. It's on the screen. I'm not going to necessarily read it out, apart from to emphasize a couple of lines in here. So in the sort of bottom of the first paragraph, it talks about the need to redesign the service and prioritize prevention and protection activity, which is there to be provided in a flexible, affordable and sustainable way. And hopefully throughout the course of this presentation, you've heard me emphasize on many occasions the need for early intervention, getting in there early, upstream activity, understanding what the root cause of problems are, and working collaboratively with partners and communities to put in those protection factors that help either remove, reduce, mitigate the risk, so that basically the need for those acute intervention services, either ours or other agencies, is significantly reduced. And finally, what next? Well, it says here that the community risk profile is completed, but I would like to stress the point that it will continue to be something that we work on, we develop, we refine, we enhance, and we're doing that currently about looking for much wider data sets that are available that we can use to give us that more informed view. Our current community risk profile is available. There is, if this is out there for people to use, that is if you go onto our website, which is northyorkshirefire.gov.uk, you can actually find a copy of the community risk profile available for people to read and go through. It's informed our gap analysis. So what is it that we currently do that we want to improve? It helped us to set out options about how we want to better resource to the risk. And that's a piece of work which is coming towards the end and will be subject to public consultation through the summer of this year. Towards the end of this year, we will then start to look at how we hopefully look to implement some of those options about how we can deliver our services in a different way. And like I say, we'll continue to use this model and take the learning from what we've done, but also the good practice and the information we're getting nationally from other areas. So that basically brings me to the end of our presentation. Hopefully that has answered the questions you've asked us on behalf of North Yorkshire Fire Service, unless there's any further questions.
Tom?
Thanks, Zoe. Yeah, Dave, just quickly, I mean, you mentioned earlier about how, and you mentioned again how you're going to be continually developing this. And you've also mentioned about the ability to kind of drill down to more granular detail, which will help you with different things. How is this going to impact? How is this risk profile going to impact the way in which our firefighters and teams work on a day-to-day basis in the future? Can you kind of bring to life a bit about how you're actually going to use this, not just for those big strategic decisions as we're discussing at the moment, but for those the day-to-day business of the service, please?
Yeah. So when I've spoken about prevention, what we're working very hard to develop and embed more in our service is it's often referred to as the public health model, but really to understand what early intervention is, and I mean primary and secondary prevention. So this is that really, getting in there very early upstream. What are the things that put people at risk? Now, North Yorkshire Fire, we've spoken several times about how we work in partnership and collaboration. We address that around road safety specifically, and a bit more towards water safety. But it's much wider than that. We are strategically and statutorily connected with partners on lots of different areas and support each other in very much trying to deal with some really significant community issues. This community risk profile helps us to better understand that and to shift our thinking away from something's happened, how do we stop it getting worse, or doing something very much around that event, to really getting in there with others to actually stop it even getting to that point. Now, that's taking time to embed. That's quite a significant step change for us, but it's really important that we continue to have that narrative with our staff. I think it's very much like framed within the fire and rescue plan. I know it's certainly something that our colleagues from the police are very focused on. Again, local authorities, public health. You know, it's very much the language, the discourse that's being used. And I think it's just because it's so key and embedded within the community risk profile, therefore featuring into the risk resource model, that we we benefit from that. And therefore, when we start to create our interventions, our prevention activities, we're having that depth of understanding that allows us to change what we do, you know, to not just, for example, we've had a fire, we'll go and do some leaflet dropping and we'll go and do some localized work. What is it about that, and who are the people in that locality, or wider than that? But that's that shift, that's that tertiary end of prevention. What we're saying now is it becomes a real focus. So we now know through our profiling, where do people reside? Where's the emphasis? What is it about them that we want to understand? And how do we get into a really granular level? So, you know, going back to that household level information, or ideally through referral pathways. So referrals into our service for our support is what we aspire for, because that really means that we're putting our resources and our targeted interventions to the right people who need it the most. Yeah. So it is a long-term strategic, you know, intention that we've got to redesign prevention protection services, support communities, be more resilient, whilst absolutely, as you said all the way through, preserving the ability to respond really effectively when we need to, if things have gone to the stage where that's the you know, what's required.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Dave. That was very informative, thank you. So going on to agenda item 5, and that's the fire service performance update. Dave, am I coming to you, or is it?
Oh, yeah, I think it's me as well. Just 1 second. Right, okay. Just try and pull it up for everybody. Can somebody just again tell me if that's not yet? No, not. So. Does it come now?
Got the slide deck now. If you put it into presentation mode, then.
Did it not come on yet? Oh, right. Sorry.
Yeah.
Has that worked?
Yeah.
I will be with you in a second. I've just lost you. Paul. Lost you. Sorry, give me.
Dave, I can share the slides for you if you like.
It's not coming through.
It's
is it not working for you?
It's not now. No, 1 second.
It's going so well.
There you go.
Okay, Tom. So thanks you for that. Sorry, don't know what happened there. Okay, so just moving on to our performance report for, in effect, the month of February. This data was, as you can see there, provided middle of March, or very first couple of weeks in March. Incidents over the course of the month, what you can see here is that by comparison to January and December, we've seen a small increase. December to February are the same. I think the significant thing just to point out, and this is what I was referring to in the community profiling work we just talked about, is that special service, which is the phrase that we use for quite an overarching range of incidents, from road safety, road, water, working at height, lift rescues, etc., animal rescues, is a significant part of our work. Probably more so on some occasions than, or most occasions than fire. You will see here, however, that false alarms, the lighter blue category, still represents a significant proportion of our work, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on, although we are seeing some interesting changes there. The breakdown here is around our most significant incident type that we go to. Again, I think just things to point out of note. You'll see there it talks about what's called a SS, a special service call for dangerous structures. We have seen a significant increase in that, or quite a large demand for that in January and February. And this inevitably relates to the storms that we've experienced through the winter period. So we're often called out to deal with unstable and unsafe structures. That can include from trees to buildings, things that are blown away from property, and it's something that our staff respond to and deal with. So we've seen an increase in that. Hopefully, as we move into the more stable and settled weather of the spring and the summer, that will come down. We do and have seen an increase in the need for us to assist with flooding. Flooding inside premises. So quite often this is whereby there's been external events, so rivers have flooded and it's affected property. Generally doesn't relate nowadays to where you've had burst pipes in property. That used to be something that was the main contributor for that, but maybe less so now. In terms of RTCs and around scene safety, again, fairly steady state on that one. And something that we've mentioned before, we are keeping a vigilant eye on this, is the request from other services to for us to help them gain entry, particularly the ambulance service, where they require us to help force entry into a property because the occupier is either incapacitated or indeed worse, and therefore we're keeping a really close eye on that, because I think that's putting our staff into a place where we're seeing that they're becoming exposed to dealing with more body recovery, for example. Can you move on, Tom, please? Again, a slide that just basically reiterates and just reaffirms what I've said. As you can see there, false alarms are significant in terms of the number of the call volume. I'm going to go on slightly in a couple of slides just to break that down. Here you go. No, you can go on, Tom, it's fine. This slide here is tracking automatic fire alarm attendance for those that are generated what we call false alarm apparatus. So there's a fault on the system. We generally break down false alarms in three categories: false alarm apparatus, false alarm good intent, and false alarm malicious. Last month I reported that we'd seen a reduction from 238 to 182, and was waiting to sort of see whether that would be a continuation. Well, you can see from that slide that it has continued to fall, and we've got now down to 161. So we've seen quite a significant reduction over a couple of months in the attendance at activations of fire alarms in premises, and we'll continue to monitor that, look at that, and try to understand actually why we see those areas where it goes up and then comes down better. Next slide, Tom, please. So the next series of slides really kind of break this down into more of a more detail. But one of the challenges we've got is a lot of the calls for us to attend that come from detection systems are to residential properties. So residential can also include domestic dwellings. And we have a policy whereby we will attend most, if not all, of that category. And you can see there it's a significant number. 80% of the false alarms that we attend are in those sorts of premises. When we move into non-residential buildings, again, less of them. But we do have some criteria here now in our policy about what we will and won't go to, and we are looking at that again in much more detail about how we can best manage that to really reduce the burden on our service of going to what we then class as an unwanted fire signal. And what you can see there, which is actually really quite pleasing, is that by far the smallest amount and very sort of like few activations, 37 in almost a calendar year, are what we call false alarm malicious. So it's something that is worth pointing out, that we don't have a problem, a significant problem or issue around people requesting our services by calling us in a hoax way. Let's move on, Tom, please. You've been asking questions in the last presentation around fire cover. These slides show how we're operating towards our fire cover model. You can see in the legend at the bottom, so maximum, the blue, is when everything's available. Rather pleasingly, you can see in the month of February, we've seen an increase, or in this year actually so far, in the occasions where we're having either all appliances available or certainly operating in the optimum space. And we've seen a reduction in the times or frequencies when we've been operating in the other end of the scale, where we're in the critical area. So with less than 32 of our firefighting appliances available. So really good that we're seeing the increase at the right-hand side and the reduction at the left-hand side there. Next slide, please, Tom. This really plots our individual station availability. This is our on-call stations. And this is after we've made cover moves. So again, you can see fairly steady state between January, February, around 80% on-call availability on those stations that follow that duty system. This is something that we monitor on a daily basis. We have our called duty silver officers and our control staff. They have the information at the start of shifts, and we make the necessary cover moves to best use our resources to improve the situation. So again, the post cover moves part is quite significant there. Yes, Tom.
Can I just I recently saw a graph which showed on-call availability by time of day, and I think it would be really interesting to see that coming through in these presentations in the future, if possible, please, because monitoring that, I think, is really critical to what we've been talking about as well. So if we can talk about it outside this, but just wanted to note that for the record. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I've made a note for that, Tom. Okay.
Can I just come in on that too, please? I think that would be very interesting. Can we make sure that happens going forward, please? Thanks, Dave.
Yeah. Okay. Next slide, please, Tom. These next two slides look at basically our protection and prevention activities. So rather pleasingly now we are starting to see that real increase in activity in both those areas. Protection, for everyone's benefit, relates to our fire safety. So this is work that's undertaken in the non-domestic environment, so working with commercial premises. We do that in a number of ways. We are the regulator for a piece of legislation called the Regulatory Fire Safety Order, and that allows us, where required, to enforce legislation right through to prosecution. So our staff are now undertaking back to full operating model of undertaking scheduled audits, so going into premises and checking to make sure that the business is compliant with that legislation. But we also do a significant amount of consultation work, as in we are a statutory consultee for things like building regulations, whereby building controls and approved inspectors forward plans to us, and we are required to go through the plans and make sure that they are compliant with the building regulations, but also if we see things that would be need to be remedied under the RRO, it's much easier to get it at design and build stage rather than when it's been occupied. So that's why we are one of the consultees. Next slide, Tom, please. And again, we are now seeing increased activity levels in prevention. We are not purely fixed on just activity. It's really important to stress that it's about the quality of the intervention, where it is, what we do, who we're doing it with. So again, this is a count, so it is on the activity levels, but You know, I mentioned earlier on when we talked about evaluation and understanding the outcomes from what we do. But you can see here that we've got some charts aligned to what I talked about in the community's profile around domestic, road and water safety. And again, we are seeing significant activity in the domestics, so working with households. And again, with road safety, we're really looking forward to the next few months where we sort of launch some of our new initiatives and work again in partnership with our colleagues on hopefully reducing and making the roads much safer in North Yorkshire. So that basically draws us to the end of the performance pack for North Yorkshire Fire today. You're on mute, Zoe.
Oh dear, how many times? Right, so thank you very much. Oh, Tom, I see you want to come in.
Sorry, I did just want to ask Dave. So obviously we just had the presentation around community risk, and we've been talking a lot about prevention there. And the last slide, which I'm still sharing actually, talks to us about the prevention work that you're doing. In terms then of where you've identified the risk and who you've identified is at risk, in terms of that likelihood and severity, those likelihood and severity factors, are your safe and well checks being targeted at those categories or those areas, those categories of people already? If not, when will you start doing more of that? And can we get some of that data thrown onto here so that we can understand how you're addressing those risk factors through your prevention work, please?
Well, the simple answer is yes, it does. But as always, we can do better. So we are learning, we are looking at ways that we can improve how we do this. So we're about to bring in a new online referral system called FireSafe that basically allows us to ask people to fill in an online form. It's a smart form, so in the background there are weightings and values attributed to the answers that people give. And a smart form also, if you answer yes, it opens up more questions, and so you build up the score. That will create a preliminary risk level, again going from the sort of very high right to very low, or very low to very high. And we will look to make a response to the request for intervention for the medium to very highs. And we'll set a frequency or a time frame of how quickly we'll do that. But the questions that we ask very much rely to the sorts of things I talked about in the community risk profile. So occupants on age, frailty, behaviours, and that will hopefully then mean that we are going very much more towards the right people that need that level of intervention. But we're also using that tool and sharing that with partners, so they can actually make the referral on behalf of an individual. So it's not just the resident in a household that will do it; it will be partners that can actually do that for them. And that's one of the sort of buttons that people press, so we know where it's coming from. So it's a much smarter way of actually understanding the issues before we go, risk rating it, how quickly we want to go and do that intervention, and also reporting to places like this about what we've actually done in terms of answering your questions more fully. So yes, we do. Yes, we want to get better. Yes, we're going to get better, and hopefully I'll be able to provide you with more information going forward.
Great. Okay, thanks again, Dave. So moving on to agenda item 6, North Yorkshire Police Custody Process Presentation. So handing over to Simon. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here to speak this afternoon. My name's Simon Williamson. I've got a short presentation on police custody and our processes and procedures, which I'll just share on the screen with you now. Hopefully that should appear shortly.
It is.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to talk through custody process and the suites and the offers that we have at various sites within North Yorkshire. And then I'm going to move on to some of our challenges and some of our forthcoming opportunities within custody. So the first slide shows the location of our custody suites and voluntary attendee sites across North Yorkshire. We've got 3 main suites, one at Harrogate, one at York and one at Scarborough, which are the custody suites for the force. And then we have 13 voluntary attendee suites, which are situated at strategic locations across North Yorkshire. You'll see from the map they're denoted by the table and chairs, and they're situated Settle, Richmond, Stokesley, Whitby, Scarborough, Malton, Selby, 2 within York, 1 in Fulford Road area and 1 at Athena House, and at Tadcaster and at Harrogate. So really quite a comprehensive offer of locations across the force to complement the 3 main sites. Moving on to discuss our custody estate in a little more detail, North Yorkshire Police operate what we call a centralised custody model. This is in common with many other forces and is seen as best practice. The principles of a centralised custody model are that it is run by the Criminal Justice Department rather than separately out on area, so that we can ensure that best practice, national learning and reflective practice are fully embedded, and we have control over the processes and procedures within our custody estate. As mentioned already, we have 3 designated sites, York, Harrogate and Scarborough, and they operate 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The total cell capacity within North Yorkshire is 57. York has the largest capacity at 24 cells, Scarborough at 17 and Harrogate at 16. But we normally operate around about 30 to 40% of our cell capacity, so we have a great deal of flexibility within our estate, which allows us to flex across seasonality, different periods of demand, and also if there's any issues at any of the estate, we have contingency plans in place to ensure that we're always able to offer the service and level of service provision at each custody site. Custody clearly is a high-risk environment, and there are complex needs of suspects and detainees, and our principles are all about keeping people safe and placing detainee welfare at the heart of everything we do. And I'll go on to talk in a little bit more detail about vulnerability and identifying such issues. Tom.
Thanks, Simon. I want to ask a question about the centralised custody model, if I may, because obviously there are pros and cons of the kind of model, and you know, when Northallerton custody closed, there was quite a body of concern amongst local communities about the fact that all the people, you know, anybody who was arrested and detained in our kind of northern areas would have to travel down. This might be a question which Lindsay wants to respond to, because it probably touches more upon local policing to some extent. But we were promised at that point in time that there would be a kind of a handover model put in place whereby officers travelling down with detainees would be able to hand over detainees to the Harrogate team, for example, if they're coming from Richmondshire, in order to improve or rather reduce the amount of time that they were abstracted from their local area. Can you tell me whether that model is still working? How effective is it? Because there is still a level of concern amongst communities in terms of when we talk to them about custody provision in the area, especially in communities in our kind of border areas, if you like, about the level of time that it takes officers to come in and what that means. And we hear concerns raised by police officers as well about the level of time they're being abstracted. So I just wanted to understand a bit more about how that model is working and the impact of moving towards that centralised custody model is having on local policing, please.
Thanks, Tom. Great question. Ma'am, did you wish to come in first?
I don't want to usurp your answer, but just to set the strategic scene before you come into the detail, I suppose it's really important, I think, to reflect on the business case in terms of the closure of that custody suite and the efficient and effective use of resources to deliver the best possible policing service. And I suppose just to remind ourselves that when we did that exercise, the average number of detainees at Northallerton custody was 1.5 people every 24 hours. And in order to look after those 1.5 people every 24 hours requires a custody sergeant 24/7, so that's 3 people or 2 people on 12-hour shifts each, a detention officer, healthcare provision, etc., etc. So I think just important to know the numbers that we're talking about, because if people live in other areas of the county or the country, indeed, watching this and think, well, you know, your custody suite's got 24 people in it every 24 hours. It hasn't. So I think just to set the context there before Simon comes in with the detail about transport.
And of course, Lisa, let alone the cost of replacing the custody suite in Northallerton, which was in a dire state anyway. So yes, taken into account. It'd just be interesting to understand how the model is still working.
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, Simon. And also the change in Code G of the Codes of Practice of PACE. So the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, Code G, came in, which actually means we voluntarily interview people much more than we arrest now, because the grounds for arrest have changed since the original custody model. So there's a whole plethora of things going on, but I'll hand over to Simon for the detail in terms of then when we do arrest somebody in Northallerton, what's the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mal. Thanks, Tom. Great question. And you've, to some extent, stolen some of the thunder of my presentation, because I do cover off a number of these aspects as we move through it. Firstly, I would say that, you know, in terms of it on a tactical level, the model does work well. I've certainly worked within the Harrogate Command at Deputy Commander level, and I'm well aware of the processes running very smoothly in terms of handover of detainees. As a previous Inspector and Sergeant in Northallerton and Richmond, I do know the demands very well there. And I feel that we've been able to flex and cope with those demands, partly because of the expansion of voluntary attendees and the offer that brings. Also because we've enhanced our disposal options in terms of out-of-court disposal and reduced the demand on custody through early intervention and prevention work as well. In terms of the practicalities of having a number of suites, I just draw a distinction between centralised custody model, which is around governance and scrutiny and policy and procedure, and that's really directed by the NPCC as best practice, and we closely link in with those networks and follow the lead in terms of the model, as opposed to geographically centralised custody, which is a different matter. With the 3 suites being situated at Harrogate, York and Scarborough, we have 1 per command and 1 nearest our largest urban centres. Geography is always going to be a challenge for us in North Yorkshire, and the cost of a custody suite, as already described, is huge. And as I'll go through my presentation, I'll talk about some of the services we offer, and whilst they create a fantastic service and actually place detainee welfare at the heart of what we do, the truth is they're very expensive. And so the number of sites we can offer across our geography is, I think, for me, more about offering centres of excellence and focusing on quality at those sites.
Okay, thank you. It's great to have that reassurance that you feel that it's working well. Perhaps outside of the meeting, we could look at some of the data around abstraction times, just so that we're able to assure the communities that actually the amount of time, you know, taking into account everything that you said there around voluntary attendance and so on, actually the number of arrests and what that means in terms of abstraction times, then we'll be able to provide some assurance to communities around that, because I take completely in what you said into account on that. So sounds really positive. Hopefully it's working really well. Just drilling into that assurance would be great.
Could I ask a question off the back of that one, Tom? And that's about transferring detainees sometimes require long journeys from one area to a custody suite, and I just wondered how North Yorkshire Police transfer them safely and efficiently, please.
Of course, Commissioner. We have a very detailed policy and procedure on the safe transportation of detainees and complex risk assessment procedure to ensure that the correct provisions are in place. So firstly, they have to be transported in a vehicle which is fit for purpose and which is suitable. And then, depending on the needs of the detainee, we need to put suitable observations in place, which may include an additional officer travelling to keep them under constant observations, as well as search provisions prior to being transported. And consideration about medical needs will always come first. And if medical needs dictate that they should be going to a healthcare facility rather than custody, then that's the choice that should be made.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just excuse me, sorry, I'm just going to have to go back to my final slide. I've missed one bullet point, which was that the staff within the custody suite are independent of the investigation. So their role is to ensure that the detainee welfare is paramount and that the investigation is fair and all of the legal and policy aspects are adhered to. So in terms of staffing and resourcing across our suites, firstly, legislation and policy dictate that custody suites must be managed by a fully trained and operationally competent sergeant, and that's one per suite at the 3 suites. That's not we often run with far more than one per suite, but that's a legal minimum that needs to be adhered to. In addition to the custody sergeants, we also have police staff detention officers at each suite who are specially trained to national standards, and they provide support, care and of the welfare of the detainees. Our current establishment, we have 24 sergeants working across the 3 suites on a 4-on 4-off shift pattern, and 28 full-time equivalent detention officers. Optimum staffing levels are carefully managed against previous demand data, and we always ensure that we look ahead across issues such as seasonality, previous demand at similar times of year, and any predicted events or large-scale gatherings which may have an impact on policing. And that's a constant exercise which is revisited every week as we predict ahead to our future demand. The management of the 3 suites is undertaken by 2 managers at the rank of inspector. I will go on to some separate additional governance and policy arrangements that we also have within criminal justice. So moving on to staff development in terms of the training and accreditation that our staff have within the suites. All our staff work to nationally authorised professional practice, and that is our absolute benchmark of the standards we need to adhere to. A training is aligned to a national curriculum and it's specialised for this role. Both the sergeants and the detention officers undertake a 4 to 5 week in-house training course in order to be qualified to work in the custody environment. We don't have generalists working in custody and covering on an ad hoc basis. Our staff are specialists, they're trained for the role, and they have dedicated continual professional development and support. Once they've completed the in-house course, they also must be signed off as competent following a period of on-the-job mentoring, and must remain operationally competent through continual PDR assessment. And as mentioned, we have a continued professional development, and we operate a continued learning environment, sharing lessons learned, closely scrutinising and debriefing any adverse incidents or national learning, which comes through us to the MPCC or IOPC from issues around the country. The next slide shows arrest figures for the 3 custody suites across the past five-year period. What this slide shows is York denoted in blue, Harrogate in the amber colour, and Scarborough in grey. First glance, you'll see that York is our busiest suite and remains so, with volumes at Harrogate having fractionally increased over the past decade, remaining on a similar level to Scarborough. You'll note that in 2020 to 2021 we had reduced numbers of arrest. It will come as no surprise to yourselves that this is an impact of COVID and some of the suppressed demand that we had during the COVID period. Although during which time all 3 suites continued running and operating safely. Our volumes of arrests in North Yorkshire have stabilised around about, COVID accepted, the 12,000 mark per annum, spread across the 3 suites. That's down from arrest figures in 2010 period of about 20,000. That's largely due to the fact that we now have far more people dealt with via out-of-court disposal, vulnerable attendees and other processes, as well as against a background of a nationally changing demand and arrest profile. This slide, which I'm afraid is very multicoloured, so apologise to anybody. It's our voluntary attendance figures divided by the 13 suites that we have. So the top colour relates to Alverton Court, and then you'll see if you go through it as the various colours, the different levels at each suite. What we saw from going back further from sort of 2014 is a gradual increase in the number of voluntary attendees at our suites, really shooting up in the 2017-2018 periods as we rolled out a larger number of suites across the force. And recently, as we've opened some of the more outlying ones, such as at Settle and at Tadcaster, we're seeing growth at those sites. I'll come on to talk about the difference between arrest and voluntary attendance shortly and give a little bit more detail of some of the advantages of either option. Again, figures have been slightly suppressed by COVID during the 2020 and 2021 periods, which show a slightly different pattern to the curve that we saw throughout the decade. So arrest versus voluntary attendance. For an arrest to be made, there must be at least reasonable grounds to suspect the person's involvement in the commission of a criminal offence, and there's reasonable grounds for believing that person's arrest is necessary. And that places an onus upon the officer arresting to make an informed decision, considering whether the investigation can be carried out effectively by a less intrusive means, taking into account the situation of the victim, the nature of the offence, the circumstances of the suspect and the needs of the investigation. Where the arrest criteria is not met, then the suspect may be invited to voluntarily attend an interview under caution. This is all governed by Code G of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act Code of Practice, which lays out strict criteria whereby an arrest can be used, and under the circumstances it should be used or may be used. Voluntary attendance, or the VA process for short. As mentioned already, we've made a significant investment in our voluntary attendance suites in North Yorkshire, and we have 13 suites strategically located. The custody landscape has changed over the past decade to include a broad suite of options that include arrest and voluntary attendance, diversion recourses and out-of-court disposals. And these voluntary attendance suites provide an option for, as an alternative to custody for interviews to take place. What's really important to emphasise is that while somebody is not under arrest and free to leave a voluntary attendance interview at any stage, they're still entitled to free and independent legal advice. We still conduct risk assessments, there's still access to healthcare and liaison and diversion services, and the person undertaking the VA process has exactly the same disposal options available as those under arrest. One of the main advantages that VA brings us from a capability perspective is officers remain in their area and close to their base location whilst conducting the processes.
Can I ask a question on the VA suites? I mean, I know there's been significant investment. Do you think we have enough across North Yorkshire to meet demand?
I think we have a very good spread of VA suites now, particularly with the recent suites opened at locations such as Settle and Tadcaster, which have addressed the need. I think there's a need to always continually review if we have enough, and to listen to feedback from officers and ensure that we have sufficient. I think we're in a very good place with VA suites, but that doesn't mean there wouldn't be a need to ever expand as we review our demand continually.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to touch upon pre-charge bail, post-charge bail a little, and released under investigation, but just to draw a distinction between the two. The Police and Crime Act in 2017 introduced a significant reform into pre-charge bail, and it introduced the presumption of releasing a suspect without bail under a status which we refer to as RUI, which is released under investigation. Bail, which can be used either pre-charge or post-charge to place conditions upon a suspect to prevent offending and to protect witnesses and victims, and to manage the suspect by placing conditions on their freedom and defined timescales for the investigation. Whereas at IUI, suspects released under investigation without any conditions restricting their freedoms. In North Yorkshire Police, we have a dedicated bail sergeant and we have a robust suspect management policy and monitoring regime, which we've aligned to national guidelines for monitoring investigations on those released under investigation. This provides us with assurance that those investigations which are under the IUI status as opposed to bail status have the same level of scrutiny and timeliness applied to them, and that those investigations are conducted in an expeditious manner. That includes levels of review which escalate through to inspector and superintendent level at certain timescales. We've also introduced the role of the Victim Services Quality Assurance Sergeant. That's a role that's been recently aligned to criminal justice to bring additional focus around victim engagement and to better understand our services to victims, and to give us a deeper understanding around issues such as victim attrition and how that relates to the timeliness of our investigations and bail processes. Of significant note, the Bail Act to be amended this summer, as our current timescales we're aware of, and that is likely to remove the presumption to release without bail and instead offer a neutral balance on whether bail and IUI should be used. Tom and Jenny, sorry, I think you may have been first. I do beg your pardon.
It was Tom first.
Oh, Jenny, you go first. That's fine.
I was just going to ask Simon, the Victim Services Quality Assurance Sergeant, is that the individual that would be looking at compliance against the Victims Code as well?
Yes, Jenny. They've recently started with ourselves in criminal justice, and they're currently familiarising themselves, and that is included within the role.
Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. It's great to hear about the improvements around IUI, albeit it kind of the presumption is being taken away, which I know there's a lot of mixed feelings about IUI, wasn't there? And at one point it was particularly negative, shall we say, because there were increasing wait times. But so that's really good to hear. Just wanted to ask very quickly around how a bit more detail in order to assure people and the public around how that balance is made between victim safety when releasing somebody without any conditions, and obviously that the interest of the perpetrator in not having any restrictions on their freedom. How do you actually go about making that assessment, just so that the public can be assured that there really is those kind of robust procedures, please?
Absolutely, Tom. There are a number of different checks and balances to ensure that the appropriate disposal is in place, and that would depend upon the nature of the investigation. For a serious matter which may be put before the CPS for a charge decision, then in those cases, the CPS lawyer will also review it, considering the officer in charge of the case's recommendation, also considering that officer's supervisor's recommendation, and will make their own determination on whether bail conditions would be appropriate to be applied in those circumstances. Where a CPS charge decision has not yet been seen, again, the officer considering the disposal and release of it would have to discuss with their supervisor the appropriate mechanism of release to continue the investigation, and then discuss that with the custody sergeant, who has the final say in law on the conditions which a suspect is released under. That custody sergeant will take into account the pre-release risk assessment, all the circumstances of the investigation, but also look at the previous factors of the detainees offending, the nature of the offence they've committed, and factors such as is the victim known to them, is the witness known to them, all play into that decision-making process. Bail has strict criteria in law about when it should and shouldn't be applied, and if any of the factors which would trigger the use of bail would apply, then that would form within the sergeant's decision-making and should dictate the appropriate release decision. What we've seen during our bail and IUI transition since the 2017 Act was introduced is that North Yorkshire has consistently used bail, whereas some forces went quite extreme towards very little use of bail, and we've continued to use it in appropriate cases. That use of bail has actually increased over the past 5 years. And as we've introduced the suspect management policy, which came in October 2019, we now have that rigid scrutiny on somebody who is released under investigation, which applies far more supervisory oversight into the management of that suspect.
Thank you, Simon. I mean, that's really positive to hear. I remember when we covered this topic before in public accountability meeting, and there was a lot of concern about some of those investigation times extending out a long way, and what was being done around that, and also in terms of how that victim safety element was considered. So that's really positive here. So thank you very much for that assurance. That's really positive.
I can also add that we did have the independent audit into bail and UI, which gave us some assurance into our practices, which was very positive.
Thank you.
So I'm just now going to move on to talk about vulnerability and the identification of vulnerability. The NPCC's definition of vulnerability is a person is vulnerable if, as a result of their situation or circumstances, they're unable to take care of or protect themselves or others from harm or exploitation. In custody, we do take an extremely broad view of vulnerability and expand beyond the definition. And I've just included a couple of the key areas that we have to be extremely vigilant for. Our principle is children should be arrested as a last resort, and all custody records are scrutinised by the criminal justice management to ensure that children's rights are upheld. Detention is only authorised when strictly necessary. We are very vigilant in relation to mental health, and all staff are trained upon risk assessment, on booking in, and training is delivered as part of the initial training and CPD to identifying mental health needs in custody and preventing self-harm. I'm going to move on to talk about our healthcare practitioners and liaison and diversion. So I'm not going to cover it off in detail on this slide because I think it warrants more discussion on the next slide. However, just to reference that we do have that NHS provision, which is vital in identifying hidden disabilities, neurodiversity, and as well as in treating urgent medical needs. And in practical terms, if the custody sergeant isn't sure, they've got a medical professional or a mental health professional that they can turn to and ask for an assessment and a second opinion. Clearly, addiction is sometimes an issue which resonates with the people who've been brought through our custody suites. And it's important to note that when people come into custody with that, it's often a real point of crisis in their lives, an opportunity to intervene and make a real difference and actually improve outcomes, not only for victims, in terms of dealing with the offenders within custody, but also to actually get into the life of the person who's detained and actually make a difference and an impact and turn the life around by signposting them to the right services, getting them the right support, and considering what would best serve the needs of protecting the public in terms of this individual. Is that diversion? Is that offering them a different support network? So we're really keen to be very vigilant in terms of picking up on signs of addiction, including drugs and alcohol, and we have a suite of options in terms of drug referrals and so forth, and diversionary activities which can be utilised, as well as that immediate care that we need to offer people in those circumstances whilst they're with us, which is greatly enhanced by having NHS professionals working within our suites who are trained to support people in such crisis.
Simon, can I ask you a question about children and young people? Is there a specific provision in our custody suites for children and young people under 18?
Commissioner, can I just clarify, do you mean provision in terms of services offered or in terms of the actual physical estate?
Well, we could cover both, actually. I was thinking of the physical estate in particular.
So each of the suites have dedicated juvenile cells, but we also have options of consultation rooms, which have a table and chairs and glass walls, which may be more appropriate for people who are with us a small time. We also have consultation rooms where the healthcare practitioners and liaison and diversion work. So we have options that don't always include placing a juvenile detained with us within a cell. There are circumstances where that's appropriate and there's circumstances where it's not. In terms of dedicated services and support, essentially we're using the same suites of options complemented by the appropriate adult service, which I have a slide which I'll move on to discuss in a little bit more detail next. Does that address your question for now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So just on the final 2 points on that slide, sorry, Tom, I missed your hand was up.
It's okay. Finish the slide and then come back to me.
Okay. We have to be very vigilant that we identify where detainees brought within custody are actually victims of crime. And that is very pertinent in cases such as child sexual exploitation, child criminal exploitation, and in modern slavery offence matters. It is paramount that at the earliest possible stage we identify where someone's been coerced into criminal activity, and that's to give an example to really bring that to life in the investigations such as county lines investigations, where children are often coerced by gangs operating from outside of an area to come into a new town to deal drugs under threat of extreme violence and other coercive means. And as part of an investigation, such people can sometimes be arrested as suspects, and the identification of them at the earliest possible stage, prior to arrest ideally, but throughout the detention process is absolutely key to make sure they get the proper support and the referrals and are not criminalised when they're actually victims. And finally, we have a detailed system of warning signals, both national and on our local intelligence system, which flag up any known risks and any known vulnerabilities, which can form part of our care plan and also any pre-release assessment. Tom, would you like to?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to go back to the mental health point here. I've been surfing the dashboards. We used to get some information as part of the performance pack previously about mental health detainees with mental health or mental health crisis, because obviously there are the new rules put in around the use of custody as a place of safety for and especially alongside Section 136 detentions. Could you provide us? So obviously, it was when we saw that data previously, it was always very positive, and the numbers were really low, which was really good. We haven't seen that for a little while. Are you able to provide us with assurance, please, around how often our suites are being used for adults in crisis, and also obviously the intention of the rules was that nobody under the age of 18 in mental health crisis should be coming into a custody suite, and we were doing very well at that. Can you provide us with assurance that that is still the case?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I haven't the figures to hand, although I will be able to obtain them and share them at a later date. However, what I can say is that 136 for under 18s should never be used. I would just draw a distinction between the various different mental health options which can occur within custody. So the use of 136 as a detention for somebody in the public in a public area for mental health concerns should always be brought to a place of safety at one of the non-police NHS places of safety which are in existence across North Yorkshire, and those sites, I believe at Scarborough, York, Harrogate, offer the relevant facilities and the suitably trained staff to support those people at that moment of crisis. And our principle is that 136 detainees should not be brought to custody under no circumstances as under 18s, and in only extremely exceptional circumstances as adults. I draw a distinction between that principle and where we have people brought in under arrest for an offence that they're suspected of committing, and then it becomes appropriate to conduct a mental health assessment. With our trained healthcare professionals and the use of your colleagues across the NHS, we have appropriate arrangements to ensure that an assessment of somebody's mental health needs can take place post-arrest, including fitness to interview assessments, fitness to detain assessments, and all suitable mental health assessments thereafter. And it may be that the route that takes us down then leads for that person to be subject to a Mental Health Act detention by healthcare professionals, and then they would be transported from the custody suite to a suitable place at the earliest opportunity. There are exceptional circumstances where 136 in custody occurs, where a person's no longer under arrest, but it becomes apparent that there is a requirement for their detention under the Mental Health. That's extremely rare, but it does happen, and should be differentiated as opposed to a 136 made in a public area and brought to a custody site, which should not be the case.
Great, thank you, Simon. That's really good to hear. And I mean, if we could see those figures again, because I remember we used to get the adult, the under 18, and also a count of as you described, those where they came into custody and then were assessed post arrest. So it would be great if we could see that information outside, but actually also probably if we could start getting that information coming through in the performance pack again. I'll pick that up with Abson and Lindsay outside of this. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to just touch on a little more detail around safeguarding detainees and managing risk within our custody suites. Firstly, just to say that it's a highly regulated environment subject to numerous pieces of legislation and numerous policy, particularly around authorised professional practice and Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and Code C being the specific code which dictates how we should look after people, what rights they have, etc. Similar to our earlier question from a member of the public about the right to have somebody informed, there are numerous rights which are enshrined in law, which we ensure that all our detainees are offered and supported in. I've already gone into a little bit of detail because of the way the conversation's developed, that we have a regional contract with Humberside, West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire and ourselves in North Yorkshire for an NHS provided embedded healthcare professionals. So that is grade 5 nurses in every custody suite 24/7, offering a suite of services from emergency medical care through to fitness to detain assessments, and they will see any detainee who has a medical need. And if the custody sergeant on initial risk assessment and booking in believes there's any medical need, they can be directed to an assessment by the healthcare professional. All detainees on booking in are subject to a nationally developed risk assessment to identify any threat or risk to them, and that risk is then managed appropriately. And in addition to the healthcare professionals, we also have liaison and diversion services, which again is NHS led and staffed by a multidisciplinary team of a broad skill set, often mental health professionals amongst them, who are able to signpost detainees to support pathways and offer services bespoke to individual needs. In addition to the above, we've also got all detainees have a right to an individual care plan whilst in custody, subject to their needs and vulnerability, and that may include anything from constant observations, having somebody with them, for all female detainees to ensure that there's a female member of staff who's identified to them and introduces themselves to them. There's a broad suite of options open to us to ensure that somebody's needs are catered for, and that includes languages and other vulnerabilities. Commissioner, you asked a question around appropriate adults and other support for children, so I'm just going to discuss that in a little bit more detail.
Thank you.
So the role of the appropriate adult is to safeguard the interests, rights, entitlements and welfare of children and vulnerable people who are suspected of committing a criminal offence by ensuring they're treated in a fair and just manner and able to participate effectively in the criminal justice process. This is separate to and over and above legal representation. The custody sergeant assesses the need for an appropriate adult, and that forms part of that booking in process and that risk assessment, which is done on arrival in custody. And the custody sergeant is responsible for arranging the attendance and deciding who would be the most appropriate to support in the interests of the child. That may include a member of the family, for children in care, or for other circumstances it might be a member of the local authority who's most appropriate to give that care, or it might be another responsible adult. For vulnerable adults, that may be a carer, that may be somebody who is the best person to act as an intermediary. The principle is, though, they must be independent of the investigation and they must be appropriate. The local authority has a statutory obligation to provide an appropriate adult for children who are arrested. In North Yorkshire County Council, we have an embedded on-call rota for vulnerable adults, and a similar rota is being developed for the City of York. Custody management work closely with the Youth Justice Service, Children's Social Care, and we have both partnership and internal scrutiny procedures to continually assess the effectiveness of aid provision. We now monitor the timeliness from the call for an appropriate adult to their arrival in custody, and each call for service is now scrutinised to ensure that the needs of the child are best represented and the appropriate adult's attendance is timely. Tom.
That's very interesting to hear. How positive is that that timeliness? Are we seeing a good kind of average response time?
So the honest answer to you, Tom, is that it is sometimes a mixed picture. We have some exceptionally good examples of timeliness, and because of the broad range of requirements from appropriate adults, you have circumstances where you may be calling, a child's parent who is literally in the car and down to the police station the next minute to be with you. Likewise, the local authority are in a position to immediately offer support. However, there are circumstances where it is challenging, and we are unable to compel people to attend within a certain timescale. So there's certain key points within the custody process where appropriate adult is absolutely essential, and matters such as being given your rights and entitlements in the presence of an appropriate adult being one of them, and attendance in an interview being another. There are occasions where appropriate adults attend at those key points, and that's not always fully supportive of the best interests of the child, where the appropriate adult is there as a broader support throughout the process. So I think the honest answer is that's something we're reflecting upon and working towards greatly enhancing. And it is a mixed picture of good practice with times where we have to accept that we could improve across partnerships.
And that takes me to the question I was originally going to ask on this. A few years back now, the office did quite a bit of work with MYP on improving that relationship with the local authorities around appropriate authorities. It's great to see that there's embedded call rota and one being developed for York. MYP, are you content with the level of support that is now provided by our local authority partners on this front?
I would say that it's it's a situation we should continue to endeavour to do better upon. That's not to say that I'm not content, but it's something where we can always make improvements. And keeping the principle of the best interest of the child absolutely firm and centre has to be the way that we approach this issue.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much.
So I'm just going to move on to governance and scrutiny. There's only a couple of slides remaining, so I'll just pass through this one and just provide some assurance around some of these scrutiny arrangements. I think I touched on in an earlier slide that we're part of a number of national networks, including the NPCC Lead for Custodies Network, Bail, as well as other criminal justice networks. And we also participate in regional meetings with colleagues to share best practice, learn from adverse incidents, and reflect upon where things can be done differently or better. We're subject to HMIC FRS inspections. They're every 5 to 6 years, statutory inspections without notice, and scrutinise the running of our custody suites and all aspects of the custody process. In addition to that, there's also the Independent Office of Police Complaints Scrutiny, and the learning which comes from them, from other forces, as well as from our own incidents. And there's the role our internal professional standards department play. And we routinely review incidents and self-refer and discuss matters with professional standards to have an open and honest learning environment where we seek to improve on reflective practice and always seek to make to debrief incidents and make improvements in how we deliver our service. We also routinely monitor our commission services in partnership with the PFCC office and participate in the Regional Healthcare Board. And we also have the independent custody visitors who, without notice, can arrive at custody suites and inspect the running of the suite, the facilities on offer, speak to the detainees, and gain an understanding of our standards and scrutinisers in terms of our custody processes. The ICVs, the independent custody visitors, were limited during COVID due to restrictions in terms of their availability to come into a high-risk environment. However, I'm pleased to say that is now back up and running, and we're now inviting, able to facilitate that scrutiny within our suites. In addition to the management structure I described with the head of custody role and the 2 inspectors for managing the suites, we also have a criminal justice policy inspector and a policy PC, which provides a degree of internal scrutiny and independence and adherence with national best practice. All our suites are covered by CCTV, and we have microphone coverage in the suites. And one of the custody manager's roles is daily dip sampling and CCTV reviews to scrutinise staff conduct and compliance with policy. Tom.
There was a concern raised by the IOPC at one point recently about how well the CCTV covers different cells, and I know there's some structural difficulties, shall we say. Can you provide us with some assurance around how that's been resolved, please?
Yeah, absolutely, John. There's no doubt, and I'll come on to the challenges. Some challenges posed to us by the age of our estates, and CCTV is one of those issues that continually evolves. So I remember when I started in policing, we had one cell with a camera in, and that was used for detaining vulnerable people. As technology and expectations have evolved, IOPC and NPCC have made greater recommendations in relation to CCTV coverage. North Yorkshire Police have a mixed age of suites. We have 3 suites, as mentioned previously. York was built in the 1970s, Scarborough in the 1980s, and Harrogate in 2012, I think, was commissioned. When I started in the custody role, had CCTV systems in various operational states, And we've invested greatly to improving them during this time. We've had a significant investment in the servers and the reliability of the cameras at the Scarborough and York estates to ensure that we eliminate blind spots where possible, and that we have a reliable system with excellent integrity. And we've also gone further and trained up professional standards officers to ensure they can operate the CCTV system independently and scrutinise without having to go through a member of custody staff to allow those independent of the investigation dives into the system. The Harrogate system is now 8 years old. Sorry, it's a little bit older than that actually. It's 10 years old now, and so technology's advanced slightly, and now you can get a greater quality with fewer with a greater number of pixels per image and slightly better microphone quality, and so we're looking at renewing that system and have developed a business case around that. So in relation to reassurance, we've gained great enhancements in terms of reliability and stability on the platform. We've enhanced the York and Scarborough estates with modern and operationally fit for purpose CCTV systems, and the Harrogate estate, we're looking at enhancing that as well.
Okay, so still potentially some blind spots in some cells. Are there mitigations for that?
Yeah, so I believe at Scarborough, and I do apologise if my knowledge isn't entirely current because I've not been covering the head of custody role for several months. However, my understanding is that we've been that we no longer have any blind spots in the Scarborough estate. In the York estate, we've eliminated the blind spots with the exception of a small number of cells that are a slight L shape. So the mitigation in place is they are not to be used unless there are observations on the people who are detained in those cells and a manual intervention. York has 24 cells, so that is a perfectly manageable mitigation. And at Harrogate, we've never had an issue with blind spots with a more modern system and a more modern design of the estate.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. And just as a last bullet point on that slide, we also have a fortnightly custody SMT scrutiny meeting, which reviews all aspects of performance. So all all children's custody records are reviewed and scrutinised to ensure that we have only authorised detention where absolutely necessary, that we have treated acted in the best interest of that child throughout the process, and that where any appropriate adult issues have occurred, we can then deal with those, firstly on an operational level by understanding what's happened and speaking to those involved, but also from a governance level, we can feed that up into partnership arrangements where there have been problems with appropriate adult timeliness. We also routinely scrutinise any use of strip search powers, and in North Yorkshire Police that requires escalation to the rank of inspector for any children held in custody, and we also routinely dip sample and scrutinise any use of force, particularly strong force. So that's an example of the 2 weekly scrutiny, which then feeds into our overarching custody governance meetings. So just to touch on some of the strengths that I feel that we have within custody in North Yorkshire Police, we are, I believe, it's a real strength that part of our early intervention and prevention. We're all about using custody as a place of last resort and diverting people away from custody where appropriate, and using custody where it is the appropriate means of dealing with people and managing risk. We have a suite of out of court and diversionary options available, and embedded either within custody or indeed as an alternative to arrest. And as well as already touched upon, we have a large number of voluntary attendee suites so that we are able to offer an alternative arrangement to arrest. We have specialist trained staff and centralised custody suites with all of the additional facilities that we're able to offer with that structure, and strict adherence with authorised professional practice as our means of operating. We have strong partnership relationships and embedded healthcare professionals and the embedded liaison and diversion. And in addition to, we've already covered the fact that we have non-police places of safety for 136 detentions in North Yorkshire, and strong governance and scrutiny arrangements in place with a robust suspect management and scrutiny policy. Moving on to the final slide. We've covered some of these challenges already, I believe. Geography for us is always a challenge within North Yorkshire, you know, with the largest force area, and so travelling times to custody is always going to be something we have to factor in and balance. The age of our estate, we've just spoken about. It's a mixed economy of our estate, you know, with some of the design, for example, at York, now being not in the manner that you design a modern custody suite. It's you know, it's obviously been modernised, heavily invested in over the years, but there are examples of excellence throughout the country where new suites have been designed in a with a slightly with a enhanced options for dealing with detainees in creating a calm environment, offering you know, greater enhancements around neurodiversity, more rooms for partners to operate in, you know, obviously the states move on, and that's something which is, you know, part of our challenges. COVID, I've mentioned. I'm you know, hopeful that I'm talking retrospectively about the COVID challenges, but clearly it has been you know, it is a infectious disease within a small confined space is a challenge to operate within, and you know, we've closely followed medical colleagues' advice and NPCC direction in how we operate the custody suites during this challenging time. And as I mentioned earlier, we've kept all our suites running throughout and operated safely, and also supported colleagues across the criminal justice system in the courts by presenting people at court through video links. We have evolving legislation, including significant, which has significant changes. We've touched upon bail. I know we don't have time today to get into all of the changes in legislation. However, some of these can have a significant impact in terms of our operational delivery, and we're anticipating a further change in bail later this year. The dynamic nature of demand. Our demand, we work carefully to understand the seasonality and to map out the predicted demand, but the very nature of what we do is that sometimes you can't predict the surges in demand, and the requirements for the custody estate need to be extremely flexible to cope with that. I think in North Yorkshire we're in a really good place with that. With the 3 suites, we're able to flex across the 3 suites and move staff around in a dynamic fashion so we can provide custody services effectively. Finally, the complex nature of some detainees do make delivering services, you know, rightly a challenge, but a challenge that we're keen to deliver against. In terms of opportunities, technology offers some strong opportunities and some efficiencies and some increases in how we care for people. I mentioned video remands. We're able to produce people at court by video link, which can save time and efficiencies, but there are some challenges around that need working through both nationally and regionally. Video interviews, having a remote legal advice, there are huge opportunities that technology presents us within criminal justice and custody specifically. As I mentioned, changes in the state can offer opportunities, and we have the increased diversionary options, including the 2-tier framework, which is currently being worked upon, and will give us an increase on our current offer of diversionary options. Mobile evidential breath testing devices. We're currently awaiting the availability of those devices, but that gives the option of not just doing the evidential screening for breath tests at the roadside, but actually doing the evidential sample at the roadside as well, which can be highly effective in a large geographic area such as North Yorkshire with inherent travel times. So thank you very much for listening. I'll just open up to any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm really mindful of time. So very briefly, just to highlight the fantastic commission services that are available. We talk about diversion. There's obviously, and I know we don't have time for it today, but some really, really important opportunities there to divert people away from the criminal justice system and actually turn around and divert away from a future criminal behaviour. And secondly, just to offer some reassurance to the public. Simon's absolutely right. There are 2 dedicated custody inspectors for 3 custody suites. I would just not want the public to think that's all there is. At each of those stations, there are other inspectors who have the skills and can review prisoners and detainees and look after their welfare. So I just didn't want to raise the concern. That's it. That's all that's on duty. There are a plethora of inspectors also on duty and other functions at those stations that do support the custody process. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Just to say, thank you, Simon. That was really detailed and very interesting. I know we've gone over time, but I felt it was necessary to really hear thoroughly your presentation. So thank you. Thank you very much. So we go on to agenda item 8 now, which is the North Yorkshire Police performance update. And I'm handing over to Lindsay for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I know Amanda's very kindly going to share the slides for me. Thank you, Amanda. If we can go straight to the first slide, please. Okay, so this one shows a summary of our 999 call demand over recent months. The top charts show the demand over a 36-month period. And at the bottom of that page, you'll see the statistics for February. So we continue to see high 999 call data volume or call volumes coming into our control room. Our average speed of answer is currently 22 seconds per call against a target of 10 seconds. And I know, Commissioner, that's absolutely not where we need to be. And we share the concerns that have been expressed previously in relation to our current ability to answer those 39 calls in the target time. We have already established a gold group, which is a command structure around call handling performance to look in detail at how we can make some improvements on our current performance. So ultimately, we are looking to recruit to the levels that we know we require within our call handling function. But in the meantime, we are engaging with all key heads of function across North Yorkshire Police, Enable, and also within your office to make sure that we are exploring every opportunity to support the control room and free up our call handlers, making sure that they're available to answer those calls for service as quickly as possible. So we will obviously keep the public updated on our progress in relation to that and hope that over coming months that average speed of answer will come down from the current performance of 22 seconds. And the final box there shows the percentage of calls answered within our 10-second target. And again, we completely accept that's not where we need to be. It currently sitting at 53.5%. And that is an area that will be a real focus for us over the coming weeks. The box just to the right hand side at the bottom of the screen shows a significant increase in calls compared to February 21, and you can see that in the charts above. We know as we've come out of the final lockdown, calls for service have increased significantly across all emergency services actually, but we've really felt that from a policing perspective. So 42.79% increase in calls compared to February 2021, so significant increase in the number of calls coming in. We have seen a slight decrease month on month for January versus February of 3.84%, but again set against a significant increase from last year, that's still causing us some real concern and some real pressure. If we can move on to the next slide, please, that covers 101 call volumes. So again, top two charts cover the last 36-month period, and a little bit more detail at the bottom of the page when we look at February's call handling performance. So we see the calls presented, 12,088 calls. Average speed of answer, so we're looking at a target time there of 2 minutes. So again, we are above where we need to be in terms of our target answering time for 101 calls. And call duration, I think, just highlights a really interesting point there, that it's currently 7 minutes per call for call duration on 101. When we track that back over a 36-month average, it's 6 minutes 14. So we're seeing an increase in our calls for service, but also an increase in the time that it's taking us to resolve those calls once we're answering them with the public. And that's for a whole host of reasons: complexity of demand, additional question sets around COVID, for example, that we need to cover with the public. There's a whole host of factors within that, and I'm more than happy to bring that back to a future presentation if that would be helpful, just to give a little bit more detail around what's causing some of those pressures. But that's our current picture in terms of our 101 call handling performance. And again, I hope to be able to update on that and provide some further information as the goals group progresses and those actions are developed. As we move on to the next slide, that shows our policing response. So this is response times for immediate grade incidents, on average 12 minutes 44 in our rural locations and 7 minutes 52 in urban areas. And that's from the point that an officer's dispatched to them arriving at the incident. We know there's a lead-in time of 6 minutes 38 from the time that the call is taken to officers being dispatched. Again, that can be for a variety of reasons. It can be availability of resource, it can be complexity of the call, it could be requirement to contact another agency before we attend. But what we have seen is that our overall times in this time period are higher than the 2-year average in urban areas and higher in the 2-year average in rural areas. So 51 seconds in urban areas and 1 minute 38 seconds in our rural areas. That's for our immediate grade incidents, so ultimately where there is a threat to life. Our priority grade incidents, our response times average 20 minutes and 11 seconds, and that's against a target of attendance within an hour. So although there might be a delay between call and dispatch to our priority incidents based on our resource availability, our average response times are 20 minutes and 11 seconds. You'll see in the charts just below that we're seeing a slight downward trend in the immediate grade deployments during the last 90 days, but it is very slight. And in relation to our priority grade deployments, again, downward trend in our attendance or deployments to those incidents over the last 90 days. So immediate grade deployments, approximately 76 incidents per day, and priority grade deployments 78 per day. The point that I'd really like to highlight from that slide in particular is the tables at the bottom. So that demonstrates how many officers would attend an incident on average. So where we look at our immediate grade incidents, which are just on the bottom left, it's broken down into antisocial behaviour, crime and public safety and welfare calls for service. What we see is that public safety and welfare form the majority of calls for service that are graded as immediate. But actually, and interestingly, we are sending more officers to the crime incidents than we are the PSWs, and that's a shift over recent months. So really keen to understand the data a little bit further in terms of what that's telling us and some of the complexity around the crime that's causing us to deploy more officers to those incidents. So again, that's an area that myself's taken away just to have a look at in a little bit more detail, just to make sure we understand exactly what's causing that. And it's a very similar trend when we look at the priority calls for service as well. So antisocial behaviour, crime and public safety and welfare, again replicated there. We can see that while PSW makes up the majority of that demand, again we are sending more officers to the crime related incidents. So it's important that we don't just consider the number of calls, but also the nature and the complexity when we're considering our resourcing. Moving on to our next slide, this shows our crime volumes. Thank you. So we can see from the table on the top left-hand side that this is crime volumes for a 4-week period compared to the previous 4-week period, and it's based on the dates that the offences were committed. We can see some percentage changes when you look down those columns. Miscellaneous crimes against society stands out. It's almost a 20% increase, albeit it's relatively small numbers. It's a change of 5. And when we've looked into the detail sitting behind that, that's predominantly made up of an increase of sexual offences, for example, taking or making of indecent images of children. So we've seen an increase of 23 against excuse me, compared to the last 4 weeks, which is making up the majority of that increase. So they are the offences that would be dealt with by our online abuse team, and the detectives are reporting an increase in demand in those type of offences that are coming through to them. We also see an increase in theft and theft from person. So when we look into theft from person, we're looking at a change of 12 in terms of the number of offences that have been reported. A further or closer inspection of those figures would show that that is predominantly in the York and Harrogate town centre and city centre areas. And when we look at York in particular, it's an increase from 12 up to 17, and Harrogate 5 versus 1 in the previous 4-week period. So again, relatively small numbers. Having linked in with those commanders, really pleased to report there aren't any specific trends there that are causing any concern, but certainly something that we need to keep a very close eye on as we monitor our performance over coming weeks. The chart that is on the right hand side shows crimes by day of the week. So again, the only change that we've seen there from a percentage perspective is we've seen a slight increase in the number of offences reported on a Thursday. I'm not sure that gives us anything meaningful at this time for us to explore further in this forum. But again, just interesting from a trend perspective, previous 4 weeks, last 4 weeks, and then our baseline in figures. So Thursday does appear to be an emerging issue in terms of crimes reported on that day of the week. But again, something just for us to keep a close eye on over the coming weeks and months when it comes to our performance. And then the bottom chart just picks up the trend that I've already touched on in terms of the highest volume of increase over the last 4 weeks, theft from person and those miscellaneous crimes against society. And again, hopefully I've covered some of the detail there just in terms of where those pressures are and the fact that the commanders and the respective neighbourhood policing teams are aware and monitoring those figures. So as we move on to the next slide, this shows general crimes committed. It gives us 12-month data, 90-day data, and then the 28-day data for February. And what that shows is actually our trend in terms of the types of offences are very similar across all 3 points in time. So the most significant reporting of crime for us is violence against the person, and that's consistent across all 3 tables, and again very, very similar as we look at the other crime types within those particular charts. So don't intend to go into any further detail on that unless anyone's got any specific questions. Just conscious of time. Thank you. So
sorry, hope you don't mind me interrupting there. I think it would be really interesting to know what action's been taken. So when we talk about crime volumes and we look at the table, and then you mention theft from the person, and maybe Harrogate is an issue there. That's where it's happening too. It's like, what's been put in place to combat that? You know, I know this is over a 4-week period, but I think going forward it'd be interesting to find out what's been put in place.
Definitely. No problem, Commissioner. We'll pick that up next month as part of the performance. Make sure we bring that context information through for you.
Thank you.
No problem. As we move on then, the next slide shows crime over the last 24 months. Just give it a minute for it to catch up. The top chart shows the date that the crime was committed, and the bottom chart shows the date that the crime was recorded. And again, we see violence against the person and sexual offences making up the majority of the increase that we're seeing in relation to those charts. The comments at the bottom just show that the number of crimes committed in North Yorkshire in our last 12 months increased by 9.9% in comparison to our previous 12 months, and the number of crimes recorded in the last 12 months increased by 13.68%. And I think that's just to make the point that not all crime is reported on the day it was committed. So actually there's a distinction between when we record those offences versus perhaps when that crime may have happened. Moving on to our next slide. This just breaks it down into some of those key areas, Commissioner. So we've touched on already violence against the person, sexual offences and acquisitive crime, so that predominantly theft against the person, and happy to bring some further information in respect of all 3 areas next month if that would be helpful. No problem. Okay, moving on then, our next slide gives us some detail around outcomes of crimes. So we can see in the top left-hand box that over the last 3 years, we have resolved 14.68% of crime through positive outcomes. That includes charges, cautions, warnings, and some of the other out-of-court disposals that Simon touched on in his presentation. Of that 14.68%, 37.63% of resolved crimes were as a result of an individual being charged with an offence. We then have some further information shown on that slide. So top right tells us that on 14.66% of occasions, prosecution is prevented due to evidential difficulties or perhaps the case not being in the public interest. We see that there are 28% of our crimes where the victim declines to support a prosecution. And actually the majority of those cases do have a named suspect. So really interesting to understand how that compares when we look at our evidence-led prosecutions and actually what are our opportunities to continue with a prosecution, perhaps where the victim doesn't consent. I think there's further information and context we could bring there, Commissioner, if that would be helpful.
Yes, please.
The bottom box at the top talks about closed pending, where we've got an investigation complete but no suspect has been identified. So that's roughly a quarter of our recorded crime. And then far right of that slide, we see that we've got 16.3% awaiting outcome. So that could be that it's still under investigation, or actually it's awaiting review or closure by the crime management unit. And we know that that is an area that we've recently had an approval to recruit into and increase our establishment. So again, really looking forward to bringing those individuals into the organisation and seeing that figure start to come down as we feel the impact of the additional resources. And I think the chart at the bottom, which has got an awful lot of detail on compared to the size on the screen, just shows the fact that actually some of our complex investigations take a really lengthy time for us to resolve. That could be because of forensic investigations, it could be digital examinations, but acknowledging that there is quite often a lag in the time it takes for us to resolve some of those more complex investigations. Moving on. I know Simon touched on the next point in his presentation. So this was about victims' journey. We know that we are really keen to start reporting our progress against the Victims Code to the Public Accountability Meeting. Simon mentioned in his presentation that we've recently recruited a sergeant into the criminal justice team and really looking forward to working with that individual and developing our reporting mechanism. So hopeful that certainly in the next couple of months we will have something more detailed on that slide to be able to share with yourself, Commissioner, and also with the public in terms of our performance in that area. Our next slide covers stop and search, and this month specifically we have looked at age. So when we look, I'll cover the bottom bar charts first, if that's okay. You can see there it's broken down by age. We've got 0 to 15, 16 to 17, 18 plus and unknown. And within that information, we can see that where we are searching children, so those that are 0 to 15 years of age, 88.68% of those searches result in no further action. So clearly we have got some further work to do there against a national standard of 77%. We are over where we would look to be nationally and in line with our colleagues. There is a lot of work ongoing in relation to stop and search and upskilling our workforce. There's an in-house training package that's been rolled out. There are stop and search champions to try and drive up standards within shifts, and I know that that's an area that's focused on by the scrutiny panels as well. So again, more than happy to bring some further information in future if that would be helpful. I think there are a number of areas of stop and search that we acknowledge we have gaps in, and actually have got some really clear plans in terms of how we intend to address that. So happy to share that information in this forum as well.
Yes, please. Lindsay, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And then the last slides just talk about the makeup of our workforce. So we can see there we have got a target of officers of 1563. Really pleased to say that our actual officer numbers are above our target. So we've successfully landed the police uplift for this year in terms of our recruitment, which is a really positive position to be in. PCSOs, we know that we are under our budgeted establishment for PCSOs, and we are working on the recruitment plans to get those numbers back where they need to be, as well as looking a little bit more creatively about how we bring individuals into the PCSO role. So for example, cadets, and how we would develop that talent pipeline. to make sure that we maintain those numbers within our organisation. Police staff, specials and volunteers, the chart there speaks for itself. We see that we've got a slight increase in police staff and also a slight decrease in our special constables and our volunteers. So six special constables decrease and 2 in our volunteers in terms of decrease. What I can't tell you, Commissioner, is whether those individuals have gone on to become police officers through the Uplift programme, which I think would be a good news story. But unfortunately, I haven't got that level of detail to be able to provide the context. But I hope so. I would hope so. And then finally, on the bottom of that page, it just gives the breakdown of our workforce diversity. Apologies. So 3.56% of our workforce define as Black, Asian or minority ethnic. So we know there's a great deal of work that's gone on in that area to make sure we are representative of the communities that we serve. And then also our gender split, which is 53% male, 47% female. And what's really interesting as you look at the graph on the bottom right hand side is that we start to see Generation Z make up in terms of our workforce coming through as police officers. So again, starting to see a shift in terms of the generations that are represented, certainly within our officers, and I'm sure that will continue to increase across staff, PCSOs and special constables as well. And our final slide talks about workforce absence and wellbeing. So those figures were correct as of the 17th of March. Unfortunately, we have seen a slight increase since then. So the figures for this morning are showing that we have 63 people currently absent with COVID-19 confirmed cases. We have a further 45 that are isolating. So we are higher than we were reporting on the 17th of March. Just for reassurance, and Commissioner, that is tracked on a daily basis through the daily management meetings and the force management meetings. So the duty superintendent would review those figures on a daily basis, look at any areas of business that are being adversely impacted, for example, customer contact in the force control room, and look at the contingency plans and business continuity that we would need to put in place in order to address that. I'm informed that as of today, there are no areas of business that are reporting significant areas of concern because of COVID absence, but clearly that's something that we'll keep a really close eye on as those figures continue to rise, unfortunately. So I know Simon touched on the fact that he thought that's something that we could move on from. It wouldn't appear so based on our current sickness reporting, but just for that reassurance, that is scrutinised on a daily basis. And then the bottom of that page, the final section in terms of sickness. Top 4 absence reasons in the last 12 months, no surprises in terms of coronavirus featuring as our highest reason for sickness, followed by cold and flu, coronavirus symptoms and migraines. So some trends in there that I think have been very similar over recent months. And that is an absolute whistle-stop tour through the police performance pack, but I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lindsay. Yes, it was a gallop through that, but thank you very much. I don't believe there are any questions. So I'll go on to the next agenda item 9, which are there any more questions from the public? And I believe that we have had a further question from Ms Hobson, which I will read out. And Lindsay, I believe you're happy to answer again. Thank you. So it was a question about, the original question was about the mobile phone and laptops. So the second question is, the officer mentioned they run a triage programme, which I perfectly understand some devices need looking at faster as the crime is more urgent or serious in nature. However, surely that cannot mean that one person's devices can be pushed to the back of the queue indefinitely. There has to be a time limit that the police must either inspect the devices or return them. Lindsay.
Thank you, Commissioner, and to Ms Hobson for the follow-up question. It's really difficult for me to comment without the specifics of the case. So what I've offered through your office is to take away the details, make follow-up contact with Ms Hobson, understand the specifics in relation to that device, and be able to provide a more detailed reply to her, and then also through this forum next month if that's appropriate. But I can absolutely pick that up this afternoon and look to resolve that one.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And thank you to Ms Hobson for that second question as well. So we'll go on to agenda item 10, which is any other business and date of the next meeting. I don't believe there is any other business. The date of the next meeting is Tuesday, the 26th of April, 2022. I'd like to thank you very much for taking part in this meeting, and to everybody watching, and I look forward to seeing you again in our April meeting. Thank you very much.